I was sitting there quietly minding my own business and developing some other stuff, and Walter Parks called me up and said, "Have you got 20 minutes?" and threw a reproduction of this rather beautiful 19th century painting onto my desk. And I stared at it, and I went, "Oh God," because I knew I was essentially, you want to bleep this? I was fucked.
Once we got to a point where everyone knew what we were doing, they thought we were mad. When I was a kid, I did a year of graduate school, got sick of the university, as we all do. Bummed around Europe, East Bloc, West Bloc, saw a lot of coliseums. When I got to Baghdad, I swapped a book on the Irish Revolution for a book by a guy named Daniel P. Mannix called Those About to Die, which is a very tawdry sort of overview of the Coliseum and the games. But the thing that was great about Mannix's book was that it identified the ancient games with sort of modern entertainment games. And I never forgot about it. I always thought, gee, it'd make a great movie someday. And by the time I got to India, I think I decided I wanted to be a screenwriter. So, years later, when I was writing Amistad in Rome, I began researching Gladiator and working on the script.
I had worked with David Franzoni on one other project, and he came to me with some research about the Roman arena. And as you looked at the research, as I looked at the research, you realize it was completely the epicenter of the whole society. And in the way that in that period of time all roads led to Rome, all roads in Rome led to the arena. And it was the center of technology. They were literally eradicating species of animals on the world because they were taking so many to destroy in their arena in more and more theatrical ways. But as we read the research, it felt very contemporary. There are a lot of ideas of a whole population distracted by entertainment while they were missing the more serious issues that felt very much like now.
I think behavior of people is odd because it doesn't really change, does it? I think the weapons change, the clothing changes, but fundamentally people's behavior doesn't change. Politics are all essentially the same. I would even say you get equally the same amount of backstabbing today as you did then. Now it's a bit more metaphorical.
If we went to a Roman amphitheatre to watch the games, it would seem enormously familiar in some ways. You know, the way you get your ticket and you're shown to your proper seat, and the vendors come around and you buy refreshments, and it might seem perfectly ordinary. And then you realize that the spectacle is different.
Just like in a modern either soccer or American football stadium where they love to see people hit and get hurt and, the ranting of 50, 60, 70,000 people.
And we have the word WWF, and we have all of the different sort of wrestling things, and we have, professional boxing is still the biggest thing on TV when there's a heavyweight fight.
It's a question that we've all been asking and debating about is, what is the desire for blood sport and people, what is that? Is it an escape?
I think what pulls us to Gladiators is the adrenaline. There is a real excitement. Sport is exciting. Blood sport is that much more exciting. And I think there's a sort of morbid fascination the present has with the Roman past, because we ask all the time, could we be like these guys? Could we sit around 50,000 people in a great building watching someone die, cheering? Could we be like it? Or are they completely different from us? Are they monsters? Did they work differently as human beings? And I think we know that there's a bit in us that is absolutely there with the Romans. We could be like them.
When you think about the amphitheatre, whether you're watching two people fighting or a person and an animal, there's an element of unpredictability there, which is balanced out by the comparative skill of the two participants. And that kind of sort of gambling on the odds, I think, was a great attraction in those days and must also still be an attraction now. Although I think the major attraction today of looking at the Roman amphitheatre is through the telescope of time, looking at this sort of frozen cultural phenomenon, which seems so alien and yet in some ways fulfills many of the instincts that we have been taught not to indulge.
What was most important about it, and I think was least interesting to me, were the way they'd done Roman epics in the past was trying to capture, I think they were trying to capture what it must have been like to be an ancient Roman or an ancient Greek. And I don't think that's possible, first of all. And secondly, I don't find it very interesting.
We know that sword and sandal movies had been failing for about 40 years when we started work on Gladiator. And I think my best analysis was that they just felt locked in the past.
What I was trying to find a way in with Colosseum for us on Gladiator was, how is this about us? You know, how is this about the United States? And when I first talked to Steven Spielberg about it, I told Steven, I said, you know, in a way, this really isn't about ancient Rome at all. This is about Los Angeles 1,000 years from now. Coliseum is Dodger Stadium. I modeled Proximo very consciously after a CIA agent. I mean, I used to say Mike Ovitz, but it could have been any CIA agent. And we have, you know, I guess a modern morality play. So I had it all kind of worked out, and I went in to see Steven, and Steven had heard that I was going to come in and pitch a Gladiator piece. So the meeting was basically, it was Steven and Walter Parks, and Steven goes, so David, I understand you want to do a movie about a gladiator. And I go, yeah, in ancient Rome, yeah. In the Colosseum in ancient Rome, yes. Okay. And that was it. So I remember Walter called me that afternoon and goes, you know, David, do you have a story worked out? And I said, you know, I've got it all worked out, Walter, so don't fear. But Steven knew it was time.
It was just one of those pitches that, on a conceptual level, made sense immediately. I mean, a lot of people have talked about, gee, you know, why did you all get behind a movie the likes of which hadn't been made for such a long time? But I don't know why. The timing for this movie just seemed right when we heard it the first time. And as I said, the emotional contour, just again, in the very most rudimentary form, the emotional contours were there of this basic hero's journey.
After we had solved the script, and we had a real character journey set in the Roman arena, the question of filmmaker was really daunting.
We were looking for someone of vision, of course. You know, and there were sort of two balls to keep up in the air on this. One was we were doing a serious, dramatic piece, and performances were crucial. The other was we were making this fantastic spectacle. We were doing sort of a theme park, if you will. And so we needed a director who had those capabilities.
You know, we talked about the short list of people that can do that kind of work. And on the short list, of course, is Ridley Scott. There's maybe no one who's ever been better at creating a coherent other world. You know, you think of what he did in Blade Runner.
There's a tiny, tiny handful of directors who can create worlds, who can deal with enormous technical problems, and here's the important point, but not be overwhelmed by them, not literally forsake the really important issues of narrative and story and theme because the pursuit of the size is crushing. When you really look at that list, you go right to Ridley.
Unlike many people, Ridley's an artist. He often jokes about spending his twilight years in some garden painting. And so Walter Parks and I went to see Ridley, and we brought the script, and we also brought a painting, a famous painting of the arena.
The artist was Jean-Léon Gérôme, and it was entitled Thumbs Down. And it shows a corner of the Colosseum, the wall, and one seems to be looking back up at what probably is one of the more corrupt of the emperors. Looks like Nero, I think, who's actually leaning over in a kind of rather debauched state with his thumb down, indicating that the Antibatai, who is the armored gladiator, who's standing over the vanquished who was still alive, and he's looking up at the emperor saying, should I kill him or not? And the guy's doing that, which means death.
I remember showing him the picture and then launched into the pitch. Doug and I told him about how we're going to change the script and what our ideas are. And I remember talking to him, and he'd be looking at me very interested, and his eyes would glaze slightly, and his eyes kept on going to the picture. He'd come back to me very politely, came back going to the picture. And I think halfway through, without really hearing the pitch at all, he picked up the print and said, yeah, I can do this.
I just love the whole, you know, view, that segment was what really turned me on to it. Saying, we can do that. And we haven't seen that. And certainly not with the technology we can employ today, where we don't have to build the whole arena. We can build a segment of the arena, we can expand on that, we can do all kinds of things, and, you know, really do an epic in the grand sense of the word.
When you go to the ruins of Rome now, you get really no sense of the scale and the grandeur of what that forum would have been. It's hard to get it anywhere except from some of the great epic films of the past, like Ben-Hur and Quo Vadis and The Fall of the Roman Empire, who did elaborate reconstructions.
When I was a kid, there was this TV series that was made in England called I, Claudius. And I saw that and I was like fascinated.
I think he knows what Rome is.
When I saw that Derek Jacobi was going to be in our movie, I was so thrilled because I remembered what a genius job he did on I, Claudius.
My favorite moment in any previous epic was the chariot race in Ben-Hur. I can't think of anything that was more cinematic, more exciting, and also full of character.
In both chariot races in Ben-Hur, the 1929 Ben-Hur, I think it's 1929, is amazing chariot race, absolutely amazing. And then later Charlton Heston's. There were some very good things about that. They got the scale right.
We stood in the shadow of all the other epic Roman films ever done. A lot of these stood as examples of what not to do. The trend toward the end in the 50s and 60s was a theatricality of a style of language which had more to do with, I think, classical Shakespearean theater.
Doing these things, you're always trying to find the level of dialogue that flies so it doesn't become a deeply period piece where you lose 9/10 of the audience immediately.
How can I reward Rome's greatest general?
Let me go home.
I did my basic research for Gladiators, you know, spent a lot of time hanging out in the Coliseum. But it gets to a point where you sort of hit saturation, where you go, okay, I'm not smart enough to get this right anymore. And by this time, meanwhile, I'm writing the script for DreamWorks at this point, and we brought in Kathleen Coleman, who was now teaches at Harvard, teaches a class in the Roman games, if you can believe that. She came in, obviously, and started going, no, David, that's not right, or yes, David, that could work, or who the hell knows, in which case I'd use it, of course.
The written sources don't ever discuss amphitheater spectacles in detail. They're all incidentally mentioned in the larger context of some other issue.
Remember, history is only written down by people, and that's their report on what they think at the time or what other historians have written at the time.
It's difficult to recover the view of Mr. Average Roman going to the amphitheater, except by indirect means. The fact that the Roman Empire is absolutely littered with amphitheaters and other structures in which gladiatorial spectacles took place is one pointer to the fact that there must have been a huge attraction about these spectacles.
This is a Roman-designed building, basically using the idea of a theater, but putting two of them face to face. And it was for a specific form of Roman entertainment, which was combat between two fighters, possibly to the death. This has its origin in funeral games, the idea being to make a human sacrifice to the gods of the underworld on the occasion of a funeral, so that we know the first of these human sacrifice gladiatorial games took place during a funeral here in Rome in around 250 BC.
What I would say about research is, if you can use it well, reality gives you stuff you could never invent. And it's a fantastic resource, but you have to use it well. You are writing a story, you're not writing history. And your story, I think, has got to come first.
What you can really do is actually pinpoint the dates, which are probably accurate, pinpoint the times, pinpoint the characters, and then do a bit of research about each of those characters, and then try and deduce who they were.
There was a Roman general who sort of matched this historically, who when Commodus became emperor disappeared because he was a great general and knew that he was on the hit list. No one ever knows what became of him. So I took a little bit of that, what we did know of him, and put it into Maximus's character.
The thing that most helped us was building the whole movie around a character. Because right away, you let go of the burden of we're somehow trying to recreate ancient Rome in a very specific period of time, and instead saying we're telling you a story of character. We're telling you about a man trying to find his way home. We're telling you a story about someone finding inner strength in a tough time. And right away, that's a kind of mythic story that is relevant to everybody in the audience, struggling with their own day, with their own ethics, with their own principles.
Around that, I think was one of the most interesting characters of the movie was Commodus, who was this dysfunctional, I think extremely sympathetic young emperor who people mostly just perceive as the bad guy, so a lot of it went straight over their heads. I think one of the best scenes of the film is where Commodus is told by his father that he's not going to be the emperor.
Are you ready to do your duty for Rome?
David Franzoni, the first writer, completely had the dream. And from bits of research, again, talking about people who are at the top of that society at the whim of an emperor, suddenly being a slave to fight for their life in the arena seemed incredibly fascinating. So that was all in the Franzoni control of the script.
David had brought the overall grand plan, and I think we needed the characterizations to be a little less on the nose, and the dialogue was tricky and very hard, I think, to pull off, and therefore we moved towards somebody that I'd already worked with.
Did my last draft, and then Ridley brought John Logan on, and they just worked together on a piece.
John is a very good classical playwright, and I think I needed all this information converting into a good 3-act play, drama.
John created a lot of beautiful scenes between characters. Did some fantastic work in all of those wonderful scenes in the opening, in the first act.
John Logan is a playwright, and his interest tends to be in human relationships. And, you know, I remember when I first read John's draft, and there's a moment between Richard Harris and Connie Nielsen. He says, let's not speak politics, you know, let's pretend that I'm a good father and you're a loving daughter. They walk for a few minutes and they say, this is a pleasant fiction.
Isn't it?
And I found that so sophisticated. It seemed like such a, you know, wonderfully insightful, simple, yet, you know, in terms of amount of words, but complex in terms of an understanding of this relationship. So I suddenly realized, well, wait, maybe this movie could be more than just a vehicle for great action sequences and a big, brawny, heroic adventure, but maybe we can really delve into, like, the complexity of character.
I'm pretty sure most of the dialogue that survives, most of the best dialogue that survives is John Logan's.
Rome is the light.
The scenes were the same scenes, but John, you know, had spent a lot of time working on the dialogue.
Between David and John, the script really started to shape up.
Now, I had kept the family alive, his son and his wife alive, and they wanted to kill him. And I said, look, I'll tell you, right now, I mean, my only hesitation is that this isn't a revenge film. This is a movie about going home. So in Gladiator, theoretically, it isn't necessary to kill Commodus. Of course, it's, you know, feel good if you kill Commodus. But what is necessary is that he gets home. So if you kill a family, it makes it difficult. So I kept saying, you know, I'm not sure that's the right thing.
We were always wanting him to, like, head toward his relationship with Lucilla and Connie as a, not exactly a love affair, but kind of the emotional target in the here and now. And as long as it had to do with, yeah, but trying to double back to this other family, it just never had this kind of mythic clarity that these sorts of movies really want, you know? And it was a very liberating thing to decide, well, what if they were killed?
And, you know, everybody, you know, got a head of steam on it because it was a little awkward keeping the family alive. So, well, the easiest thing to do is kill them. So they killed him.
It freed up our storyline toward this kind of emotional connection with Connie, but it also sealed the deal motivationally for Maximus. The human loss that he experiences and how that motivates him, at least through the better part of the second act, gave the movie a drive that we didn't have before. Again, so these are the kinds of conversations you have in the room, and from these conversations about theme come suggestions, plots, pitches, you know, character beats, and it just somehow in front of you, you know, a movie takes shape.
Then they began changing the script a lot. They began taking out the sort of, you know, issue that Maximus could go into the Colosseum and survive.
Part of the problem was that since Maximus was such a great warrior, any version of the emperor fighting him one-on-one in the arena made the emperor an imbecile. And so we kept struggling, and then in these ongoing story meetings, someone had the really smart idea of the emperor would stab Maximus, nearly killing him, suit him up, and then of course under those circumstances, the emperor, being cagey, could go in, finish him off in front of the crowd and win the love of the crowd.